Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. Today we're going to be talking about writing emotion. It's pretty rare, if ever, that you'll be writing a piece, at least a piece of creative work, where there won't be at least one emotion involved. To some extent, at some point, probably more of them. The writing of emotion is a pretty critical part of fiction writing, creative writing in general. The specific focus of this is not how to make your writing more emotional. It's not like how to make things sadder, how to make things more exciting or more intense. It's to talk about how to actually convey emotion. You know, emotion is critical. In a novel, you'll probably have a long string of emotional responses based on the events of the plot, with probably some kind of central emotions that build the tone of the story. In a shorter piece, like in a short story, you're more likely to have like a central emotion that is explored in the piece and that kind of colors the whole piece rather than a wide emotional range. So let's just jump into it. The first point that I wanted to talk about is about specificity. It's always about specificity on this channel, and it's to specify your emotions. There are obviously broad emotions that we're familiar with, like there's anger and there's sadness and there's joy. These are words that have definitions that we are aware of. But in the context of fiction, and honestly in the context of our lives, there is more to an emotion than just what emotion it is. In every emotion that you convey in a story, that emotion has a specific emotional context that informs it and kind of makes it a more unique, specific emotion. It's not just anger, it's the character is feeling anger because a certain thing happened to the character which makes them feel maybe cheated in this specific situation, which is maybe an emotion that they have felt before and it links back to specific events in their backstory. Anytime a person, or in this case a character, feels an emotion, there's a lot more at work. There's a whole array of factors from their whole life, their current situation, that boil down into this specific little emotional potion. You want to think about that specific emotional potion and not just say it's this emotion, but know all the factors going into the emotion and what influences how it is felt and how it is experienced to that character in that moment. There's no such thing as just like a blanket feeling of sadness that everyone who has ever experienced sadness in any instance has felt in the exact same way. Don't just ask yourself what's the emotion, ask yourself what's the specific emotional situation. Every emotion that is felt by a character has a cause and it has an effect, and those are all part of that little emotional potion. Now I'm going to next talk about what I think is the most general advice when it comes to writing emotion. I wanted to include it because I wanted to get it out of the way and because I do have points that build off of it. Any article on writing emotion is going to say this. And it's don't label the emotion, because this is a form of telling. You know, this is classic show don't tell, right? Instead of a character saying, I feel sad, we would describe a feeling of sadness, we would show them being sad. I do want to draw your attention to a very common pitfall when applying this advice. It's something that when I look back at like my teenage writing, I did all the time, and I clearly thought I was being very clever with my words. I wasn't. If you describe the emotion and still label it, you're still labeling the emotion. Let's say a character is angry, and so you have the sentence, I feel angry, and you're like, that's labeling emotion, and that's a form of telling. I need to expand on that. So I'm going to describe what it feels like to feel angry. And you might say something like, anger boiled through me. Now, boil is a great verb choice here because anger kind of does boil, like that's kind of what it feels like, but you're still labeling the emotion. Sadness tightened in my chest. Again, you're still labeling the emotion. It's great that you've got the physical sensation, but you're still labeling the emotion. It's like removing a filter. You might change anger boiled through me. Something like, I tightened my fists like my blood was boiling. That's not amazing because like I said, it's just off the top of my head, but tightening your fists shows a response to anger and you still have that physical sensation, but you're not labeling the emotion. Similarly with sadness tightened my chest, you could just turn that to like my chest tightened. And it's not that you can never use an emotion word. It's not that you can never use the word anger in your piece. There are certainly times you may even want to label an emotion, and that's done with intention. And I can't give you specific cases where it's okay, because that's up to you. If you feel like now is the time to label an emotion, in this case it works, then go for it. Nothing is really an absolute with writing at all. This is not a rule, but I do want to draw your attention to it because I think it's something that people often do because they think it's good writing, like they think it's showing, but it's actually really just an embellished form of telling. Now that that's out of the way, let's build off that idea of what showing emotion looks like. So I think the main thesis here is that showing emotion is not just about describing how it physically feels. It's about understanding how your specific character reacts to this emotion and how that's going to manifest in their actions. Like I said earlier, there's no blanket experience of any emotion. It's specific to the character. So when you're thinking about showing emotion, it's not about thinking, what does the sensation of anger feel like and how do I describe it? Although that can be good, it's asking yourself, how does this character experience anger? How does it manifest for them, this specific emotion in this specific character? Because people have very different experiences with different emotions. I am not a very angry person. I've just been using anger as the example throughout this video. It's hard to get a rise out of me. I really don't have a temper whatsoever. So when I am mad, it's almost kind of weird. It's not like a temperamental thing, it's almost more a form of sadness. Other people, completely different. Everyone experiences different emotions in different ways. Keep that as kind of a thesis as we go forward. Try to think about your specific character and how they experience this specific emotion in the specific case and how it's going to manifest for them. We want to see the emotion influence their actions, you know? It's one thing to describe what an emotion feels like, but it's a level further and I think much more impactful writing to see that emotion then manifest in something that they do. If your character is angry, it will carry on the anger. If they are someone who tends to react to anger in a way, maybe it makes them kind of impulsive and volatile, maybe they go do something really impulsive. You know, maybe your character is really mad and they're like, okay, I'm gonna go cool off because I just got in a fight with a character, maybe someone I care about. I'm gonna go cool off, I'm gonna go walk around. And while they're walking around, they see a fallen street sign and they think, I'm gonna steal it. Because I'm really mad, I'm gonna steal that. And so they steal it, and that's something that is manifesting their anger. You know, maybe they want to get back at someone. Maybe something was stolen from them and that's why they were mad. And they're thinking, okay, you know what? This is kind of my little personal act of revenge and I'm mad, so I'm just gonna do it. That's their personal reaction to anger. Not everyone's gonna react to anger in that way. I have never been so angry I went and stole a road sign. I'm more likely to sit in my room and cry. So, very different. In that case, you almost don't need to go through those formalities of what does the emotion feel like? How can I describe what it feels like? We're gonna see it in even more visceral way. We're gonna see them go have an actionable response to the emotion. And that is really what drives plot and reveals character. If the way a character was feeling had no impact on the way they acted in the plot, what would be a pretty boring story, and what would be the point of the emotion then? That brings us to my next point, which is we want to see emotion then having a consequence on the plot. So in a character-driven novel especially, there's kind of a equation of emotion that goes like this. Something happens which causes an emotion, which causes a desire or emotional response in the character, which causes them to act, which causes the plot to move, which causes another event, which causes an emotion, which causes a desire or response, which causes them to act, which moves the plot, etc., etc., etc. It's this forward-turning wheel of the character's emotions, their emotional responses, fueling their actions, which move the plot forward. That ultimately is what pulls along their character development, for positive or for negative. So that's kind of how emotion works. It's as like the central fuel of a character-driven piece. In a longer work, in a shorter work, it'd probably just be like one rotation of that emotion wheel. Now, another technique I wanted to draw your attention to, this is a bit of a tangent, this is kind of an unrelated technique, but I do think there's a way to tell without telling by juxtaposing relevant information, flashback, or detail with the emotion currently being felt. If a character is feeling a certain emotion, rather than trying to describe how the emotion feels physically, because again, not that that's a bad technique, I'm not knocking that technique, it is good to be able to physically lift up those emotions in the piece. Actually, that's great. It gives a heightened sense of body and bodily awareness of the main character, which can make the writing very visceral. However, it doesn't really work every single time. You're gonna find your writing getting pretty tired if every single time a character feels an emotion, you're just like, okay, time to describe it physically. That's gonna get old pretty fast and it's gonna lose its impact. It's more about the ripple effect of that emotion and a deeper level of it manifesting in actual action and actual also thought. One great way for this to manifest in thought as opposed to action is to juxtapose the current emotional situation with a past emotional situation. So what you would basically do is have the character reflect on a moment. This could be literally, you could put a full flashback, it could literally just be a sentence of an anecdote, kind of calls back to a time where they also felt that emotion, and you evoke that emotion and its current resonance with the main character through that flashback or through that memory. So for example, and again, this is going to be a pretty overt example because it's an example, you can make this more specific and more original and more subtle when you have an actual context to work with. So let's say your character is feeling hopeless, like something has happened to them that is making them feel hopeless and that there's nothing they can do to solve the problem. Instead of just sitting around and going, I feel really hopeless and the hopelessness feels like this, the character might recall a time they felt hopeless without ever saying that. They're not gonna go, oh, this reminded me of that time I felt hopeless. Instead, they might say, when I was 8 years old, I had this toy that I really cared about because it was something that, I don't know, my grandma gave me, and I brought it with me everywhere, and one day it was really windy and I was crossing a bridge and I accidentally dropped it over the side of the bridge, and I looked and I saw like the waves below and I couldn't even see it, you know, it was super high up, and I realized that there was no way that I could get it back. I think that this is a pretty impactful way of really driving home the hopelessness. You know, anytime you're like, hey, I'm digging deep into my childhood to this other time I felt hopeless as a child, like, that's really gonna hit hard.
I'm just editing this video. I just wanted to clarify one thing. I made it sound like this technique can only be used with flashbacks or things that have happened in the past, but it doesn't have to be. The character could recall an article they read about beluga whales that made them feel a certain way, something they saw that happened to someone else. It doesn't have to be a memory of their own life. You can do this technique with pretty much anything.
Obviously, this is not a technique you can use every single time, or your piece will just be full of a bunch of flashbacks to highlight moments of emotional resonance. But I do think it's a good way to build your character's relationship to specific emotions and use that to drive home impact in the fictive present of the story. I also do think it is worth, and this is more common advice, but I'll bring it up here, it's definitely worth thinking about how whatever the current emotional state of the character is can bleed into non-emotional specific aspects of the piece. For example, setting or setting description. There's kind of two ways to go about this. For one, you could just pick settings or images that reflect the emotional state of the character. This is more of a authorial thing to do, pathetic fallacy, one could say. You're literally putting the character in a situation that mirrors their emotion. You know, like the most obvious example would be your character is sad, so it's going to be raining. You know, you have to be careful with this, but you could definitely use that technique. You don't want to go too overt with it, but if you do want to pair outside details with internal emotions, it can create a greater sense of cohesiveness. You can also just describe whatever setting you're in through the lens of the emotional state. And in fact, I would pretty much always recommend you do this. Pretty much anytime you're like describing a setting, you probably do want it to be influenced by the emotional state to some extent. So if we take, for example, a field, a description of a field could on one hand feel open. It could feel like a place of possibility. It could feel like a place of unrestraint and freedom. The character might have a desire to, or they might even want to run through it, you know, with their arms outstretched and feel the long grass kind of hitting their arms and brushing past them. They might even feel like it's like kind of lifting them off the ground, like they're flying. But you could equally take that same field and it could feel empty. It could feel barren. The character might feel exposed and unprotected and want to clutch their arms around themselves. Maybe in this case, instead of it being sunny, the field is full of fog and it almost looks endless and like a place that you can't escape. You know, the wind might channel through, and rather than feeling like the wind is pushing them, we might note how cold the wind is. It might feel like a force that is battering them, like it's trying to push them over. It could be the exact same place. The character in a different emotional state will experience it pretty differently. Almost any time you're writing setting description, you probably do want to pay mind to the character's emotional state. Sometimes this is going to be extremely subtle, sometimes it's going to be more overt, like in the example I just mentioned. I wanted to close on the idea that sometimes with emotion, less is more. A few years ago, I did a video on writing melodrama, well, not writing melodrama, how to avoid melodrama in your writing, and a lot of that was fueled by some instincts I had for writing when I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, around 15, 16, my understanding of writing emotion was that the more emotion, the better, the more intense, the better, the more intensely described, the better, and the more extreme the emotional situation, the better. That is not always the case. If you want to write more about more extreme emotional situations, please be my guest. You totally can do that. But sometimes the most subtle expressions of emotion are the most impactful. Sometimes when a character receives terrible news and they have a moment of grief or heartbreak, the most impactful thing is the personal, subtle, little thing they do. Whatever little mannerism they do that is particular to them, rather than bursting into tears and falling on the ground. Not that every single instance of emotion needs to be restrained, because I do think that the idea that the best literature is subtle and restrained all the time, and, you know, unrefined literature is feral and unhinged, I don't agree with it. In fact, I like writing to be feral and unhinged, and I like it when writers don't hold back. But I do think when it comes to the expression of emotion, a lot of the time the most power is in the tiniest details, and it's not in grand displays of extreme emotion. The greatest power can be in tiny displays of extreme emotion. I bet you can think of a movie or a book or a show where, let's say, a character lost a loved one, someone they really cared about, and obviously when they first experienced that loss, they probably had some kind of more overt emotional reaction. They cried, another character held them. It was really sad. But I bet that was not the most impactful moment for you. I bet the most impactful moment of that loss was when a few chapters or a few episodes later, the character seems to be doing better and they're in a situation completely unrelated to this loss, and something tiny happens, or they react in a very small way. You know, they see something that reminds them of their loved one and it causes an emotional response in them. Maybe they don't even enact it outwardly. Maybe the way they enact it is extremely subtle. Maybe they lost someone that they had like a special handshake with, and suddenly they're in a situation that reminds them of the loved one and they just kind of to themselves do their half of the handshake. Those little moments, I bet, are the ones that really get you the most. There's a book called Treasure Island by Sarah Levine. It's about a woman who becomes obsessed with Treasure Island and rebuilds her life around the book. It kind of ends up ruining all her relationships. She has a parrot she gets because she's obsessed with Treasure Island, and the parrot, like many parrots, repeats things. The parrot starts sobbing, and you realize that the reason the parrot is sobbing is because it's repeating the sound of the main character crying herself to sleep at night. Even though we never see her cry herself to sleep. In fact, if we did, it would be way too melodramatic, and it's not stated on the page that this is the reason the parrot is making the sound of sobbing. It's just implied, but when you get there, oh boy does it hit hard. So that's what I've got to say on that. If you want to check out my video on melodrama, it's a pretty old video. I look very different. I've got extremely long hair, but I'll leave that for you to check out. So that's all I've got for this video on writing emotion. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.